Now, this is the best conversation I've ever had on the whole global boiling thing. Enjoy. Hey, all, really looking forward to today's podcast because I have Tony Heller on, no less, and he's an absolute expert, quite clearly, in all aspects of the science of the climate thing. So I'm really looking forward to talk to you, Tony. Great to see you.
Yeah, it's good to be here, Ivor, and thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, no problem. Actually, what spurred me to do this, I meant to a long time ago, but I saw your 10 or 12 minutes super concise video, a kind of a gift to the climate change disaster people. And it was just shocking the amount of fraud that's going on. And it was so elegantly displayed with the graphs. How they take a graph of temperature like this and they pick the piece where it's going up since 69, or for another metric, they choose since 84 because that's when it happens to be going up. It's extraordinary, really, isn't it, how absurd it is?
Yeah, when there's a lot of money involved, like there is in this case, billions or trillions of dollars, people's behavior tends to be pretty bad. And when there's all this money is at stake, the there was a article written a few years ago by the editor of The Lancet discussing how about half of science published science now is fraudulent, and he had included the comment that um, bad techniques get results, and that's exactly what's going on here. There's a lot of money at stake, and these academics have learned that the only way they can get this money is by using very poor techniques, and that's exactly what's been going on with climate. Um, it, they're making manipulations to the data, rewriting history, erasing history. How to lie with statistics, basically, is what they're doing, and their funding depends on it, so they keep doing it. And so the key to stopping it is hopefully President Trump and Elon Musk will cut off their funding. And then hopefully that'll be an end to the nonsense with climate.
Yeah, hopefully, but you're absolutely right, the amount of money. In fact, it's quite revealing when you see some of these senior leaders who are driving this, and they come out with it. So the World Economic Forum, there was an item, as there often is, on the climate disaster. And I think it was Schwab himself, but he basically said, guys, this is a 30 to 50 trillion dollar business over the coming decades. So they're actually dog whistling to all of the top brass. Guys, this is huge money, just motivating them, making sure they're staying on board. So it's quite disgusting. But I was going to share, I mentioned before we came on, just a slide, and I might just share it now. So, I was doing workshops the last month or two at just a new project in mental strength and resilience, which you won't have any problem with after what you've been through from the system. And also critical thinking and weight loss and metabolic health. But the critical thinking one, I decided to pick a kind of tricky example for the audience because many of the audience may be believing in the nonsense. So I thought it was good to throw it out there. And it turned out that the evidence for against table I've used for decades in engineering problem solving for hypotheses, as we filled it in and I added in some actual facts to help the group, it was almost comical the way it came out. So in an engineering world, using this tool, a hypothesis that was coming out like this, basically you'd move on to a new hypothesis. I mean, no question about it. And when we did the Kepner-Trago is not, when, where, what, and extent table, different tool, it came out pretty much the same. So maybe we could just look at some of these things from the whiteboard. I put them in type here. But the only evidence for, in a sense, that remained, and you can debate this, is the modeling. Because the hockey stick, which was quite powerful and used by the IPCC, and they got behind it astonishingly, Michael Mann's fraud, that was exposed. And there's a book, I think, something about disgraceful science or a disgrace to the profession. So that's out. The 97% of scientists agree, and we'll talk about this in a moment. That one has clearly, other papers have shown there's around 4 or 5%. if you agree by there is a catastrophe and it is man-made. So that was fraud. And the temperature shift recorded, even outside of urban heat island effects, it's well within the natural kind of vector that might occur anyway. So that's not really evidence. And the climate events getting worse, all the media say it, but even the IPCC in their last report acknowledged there's no real evidence that climate events are getting worse. In fact, you can talk to this in a moment. They're way lower, broadly. So modelling is the only thing that you could still defend as being solid. Or is it? What about modelling?
Well, a good example here in the United States is on December 19th, the NOAA's Climate Prediction Center predicted a very warm January through March in the United States, particularly along the Gulf Coast. And instead, we've been having record cold and historically large amounts of snow along the Gulf Coast in New Orleans and Florida. So they got the prediction exactly backwards. And these are the same models they use to predict for a century out from now. Um, and they can't predict accurately what the weather's going to be like in 2 weeks. They can't predict weather patterns 2 weeks out, but they claim that they know what weather patterns are going to be like next century. It's just utterly absurd. Um, the mo Everyone who's actually involved with these atmospheric models, sorry, I got a hurricane doggy here. Everyone who's actually involved with atmospheric models knows that they're really not much good beyond 5 to 7 days because of chaos. There's chaotic events which occur that change the weather patterns. They can't be predicted. They're not understood. So the claims that they can use these weather models to predict distant future, much less the near-term future, is absurd. And that's exactly what they say they're doing. They have no idea. These models are meaningless. They're just academic toys. They're like video games. I'm sure it's fun for them to play with, but they don't have anything to do with reality.
Absolutely. And I think like very top figures, like I think Steve Koonin, who's a provost at Caltech and he was Obama's science advisor. Now, I know he's extremely careful not to be branded as a so-called climate denier. But even he has come out strongly pointing out that the models differ from each other, all the models, by way more than the increases being talked about. And by definition, they cannot be correct because they all differ so massively. And also he raised some of the points that you said, and I think he wrote a textbook on physics and mathematical modeling, one of the early textbooks on it, for God's sake.
Yeah, there's just these models they're toys, like I said, they're meaningless. They there's no reason to expect that their results will be correct. And like I mentioned, we've seen a very graphic example of this in the United States where they completely screwed up the January forecast 2 weeks, only 2 weeks out. They got it exactly backwards. Why would we expect they would be accurate for the next century? It's utterly absurd. It's not science, but there's large amounts of money involved, so people can continue the old delusion of pretending that these models mean something. They're worthless. Weather models, climate models, they're good for, 5 days, maybe if you're lucky, 7 days. Beyond that, they have no value.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, on this particular aspect, even though it's used for such huge propagandistic purposes, and we also saw Neil Ferguson during the COVID flu thing, the modelling that threw the whole world into anti-scientific lockdowns. I guess the guys know that the models unfortunately have currency in real world and in media and in fooling lay people. But we'll move on from that because I don't think there's much more you can say. It's clearly absurd. It's absurd to this engineer, to you, to Koonin, and to myriad other scientists who know the clarity of what you're just expressing there. Looking back at it, the man hockey stick, many people might be familiar a little, But I recently got that book, A Disgrace to the Profession. And even I was stunned by how fraudulent the hockey stick was. I mean, using tree rings as a proxy, and in one case for a whole era, there was one tree that was used. And even the tree modeling, temperature modeling people themselves who use this stuff as a proxy, even they kind of put up their hand and said, you can't do that. And then he used modeling, and when the trees then told a different story of falling temperature from the 30s, 40s onwards, man just dropped the model and started using the real temperature data with the urban heat island effect to show a hockey. I mean, it's so insane. Maybe just talk about that a little.
Well, what's interesting about the tree rings is, the hockey stick appeared in around 1997. And at the same time, Keith Breffa from CRU did his own tree ring study, did a Northern Hemisphere reconstruction with Phil Jones. And the reconstruction showed something completely different. It showed that the 1940s was the warmest period of the last 600 years, and the 1970s was the coldest, that there was this tremendous cooling which occurred between the 1940s and the 1970s. And other types of records like sea ice, snow cover showed the same thing, that there was this incredible cooling from the 1940s to the 1970s. Then after the 1970s, there was a little bit of warming. And I find I've looked at Keith Breffa's stuff and compared it with other types of proxy data. It looks to me like the Breffa Jones reconstruction from 1997 was actually pretty accurate. But the IPCC wanted something that was showing warming. So they used Michael Mann's obviously fraudulent and absurd hockey stick graph, and threw out Briffa's. And Briffa's dead now, but he was you could, looking back at like the ClimateGate emails, you can see that he was very angry about this. He didn't think that Mann's hockey stick graph was correct. He thought his reconstruction was, but the IPCC chose it for political reasons, not because of its scientific value. So I refer to Briffa's reconstruction a lot and show comparisons of that versus like newspaper articles at the time. It was very warm around the 1940s. The leading Arctic expert at the time, Hans Ullman from Sweden, wrote an article saying that the glaciers of Greenland and Norway are facing catastrophic collapse. They were melting so quickly. In 1924, experts were saying that Glacier National Park was going to be ice-free by 1950 because they were melting so fast. And that whole history, in 1922, the U.S. Weather Bureau said there has been a radical change in climatic conditions in the Arctic, and the glaciers were rapidly disappearing. All of that history has been erased. Now they show that period, the 1920s, 1930s, as being very cold in these temperature reconstructions. It's very Orwellian. They've gone in and they've erased huge amounts of climate history and replaced it with Michael Mann's obviously fraudulent graph, which has nothing to do with reality, nothing to do with science for the past 1,000 years, much less for the past, century.
Yeah, absolutely. It's astonishing. And some of my followers, you'd be preaching to the choir, but hopefully there's people out there on the middle of the fence. So we'll just go through the key points of absurdity. And it really is. I mean, I went through a lot of the COVID flu stuff, got in the New York Times, like I mentioned to you, and got attacked and demonetized, and all the usual kind of knavery was going on. But when I finally turned my attention, because the climate stuff exploded a couple of years ago as the COVID flu went out, and I said, right, I got to look into this. And I was just shocked at how quickly I could see the absurdity. It's frightening. But I'll have to say, I'll just share now that you mentioned that. I tweeted yesterday, where is it now? Okay, here. I mean, it's actually comical if it wasn't so serious that they're destroying our future or trying to. But the fact of what you said is demonstrated by Time magazine covers, because they were just watching monkey see, monkey do. That's all they can do because the modeling is crap. So they just got to look at what's happening and try and guess what's happening next. That's how bad this science is. So, because of what you said, the really warm 20s and 30s coming to a really much lower and colder point in the 70s, Time magazine and all of the science was saying, yeah, we're heading into a cold ice age. And then, when the curve naturally began to swing a little bit the other way, we get all of this 20 years later. So zero credibility, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The winters of 1977 through 1979 were the coldest on record in the United States. 1979 was the coldest year on record in Iceland. It was very cold around the time, and this is exactly what Briffa's temperature reconstruction showed. And so, guess when? When did they start their sea ice graphs in 1979? They start a lot of temperature graphs in 1979 because it was very cold and there was a lot of ice. There was a lot of concern in Iceland during the 1970s that their ports were blocked with ice for the first time in a century. This was widely reported. The New York Times reported this, that that this global cooling thing was very serious. The New York Times wrote an article in 1970 about how the United States and Soviet Union were working together to study the dangers of a new ice age from rapidly, ominously thickening Arctic ice. So they start their sea ice graphs and their temperature graphs right at the peak year of 1979. It's just a farce. And like you mentioned earlier, other graphs they do at different times. In the United States, for example, forest fire burn acreage peaked in 1930, and then it plummeted to a low in 1983. Well, guess when we're started in right after the Biden administration took office in 2001, they erased all of that. They erased all of the forest fire history for the United States prior to 1983, which was the low year. So this is standard practice. What they do is they look at the graph, they pick the extreme, which makes their case the best, and hide all the data before that, and say, "No, look, we've got a trend here. That we've got more burn acreage than we did in 1983, or we have less sea ice than we did in 1979." In 1959, the New York Times, 1958 or 1959, the New York Times wrote an article predicting an ice-free Arctic and ships sailing over the North Pole within the lifetime of their children, right? But then it got really cold. Then in 1970, they were writing about ominously thickening Arctic ice. So they cherry pick whatever start year for their graphs or their maps they can to present their case. And even worse, if you look at NASA temperature maps, they make these very detailed historical temperature maps based on no data. I think I made a video about that last week about how in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, they have these very detailed temperature maps from 1883 showing the very detailed contour lines. They have zero data. They have almost no data from the interior of Africa from the 1880s, yet they still make up these very detailed temperature. The whole thing is it's just a fiction which these people are profiting from. It's not science. No legitimate scientist or engineer would accept the sort of behavior which they've engaged in. I have degrees in science and engineering, worked for 50 years, doing modeling. I've been doing modeling for more than 50 years. Some models are very good, other ones are completely worthless, and these climate models are worthless. And the data which these government agencies are doing, which they all make look so serious, they put an official NASA or NOAA seal on it. It's just garbage. It's just fictional data which they've pulled out of thin air, or even worse, they've just altered. They've gone back and rewritten weather history in order to create the appearance of something which doesn't actually exist.
Hey guys, just popping in here briefly. Tony is an absolute treasure, I'm sure you'll agree. But just to let you know, my critical thinking workshops and mental strength and resilience workshops, and also weight loss masterclass workshops, I have more coming, but they're all at ivorcumminsworkshops.com. And the next sessions for critical thinking and resilience, mental strength, are coming up the 20th and 21st, Thursday and Friday of February. 6 p.m. UK time, and also the HD recordings of the full session and the interactive with the attendees kind of exercises we touched on there. It'll all be available also if the time doesn't suit you. So anyway, let's get back to Tony. This stuff is amazing. Yeah, and sadly now, many of them are actually trapped in their nonsense narrative. So even if they did feel we should be backing off on the rhetoric, well, the money is still demanding the rhetoric. And I remember one of the climate guys I was talking to quite a while back, he was saying that not only are you not allowed to question it, you're not even allowed ever, or your funding will be gone, to question the severity and the disastrous nature. You know, you can't even say, look, it might not be so bad. You support the climate change, but you say it might not be too bad. You're not allowed to do that. Your funding's gone. It has to be disaster. It's totally corrupt. You know, I'll share again and just see, is there a pointer here to continue? The other evidence, yeah, the 97% of scientists agree. That's probably worth a quick minute because I get quoted that one a lot. Well, how come 97% agree? That's blatant fraud. And this was published on exposing how that was fraud, yeah?
Yeah, that was something which kind of Barack Obama made up in 2013. He made a tweet about 97% of scientists agree that that global warming is real and dangerous and a threat, or something like that. It was based on this fake study, which I think he commissioned from John Cook in Australia. I got a call from John Cook one day, or an email, I don't remember. Very excited about wanting me to participate in something. I knew something was up, because his tone was, it was obvious he was onto something. And then shortly after that, this tweet from it came out with that study. This tweet from Obama came out. So I'm pretty certain that he was chosen by Obama to create this fake study. But in that same year, in 2013, the American Meteorological Society did a survey of their professional members. Only 50% said that global warming was primarily man-made. They didn't even ask them if it was dangerous because they would have gotten laughed out of their offices had they done that. So about, it was just completely, it was just a scam. The idea, it's a psychological trick, right? It's like, um, from Orwell's from 1984, it was the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command, right? And so that's what they were doing. They're saying, forget what you see, forget the cold weather you see, forget the snow. Your opinion doesn't mean anything. You're not allowed to have an opinion because 97% of scientists say this, right? You're not qualified to question this eminent group of experts. And that's the psychology behind this whole consensus thing. Yeah, it's that your opinion doesn't matter. You're not a climate scientist. You can't question these people. And so we're just going to throw science out the window. We're going to throw democracy out the window. We're going to throw the normal due process and the normal way which legislation occurs out the window. We're just going to let this fake imaginary consensus of non-existent people make our decisions for us. And they're going to set policy. And this doesn't actually exist. And going back further to 1961, in his farewell speech, President Eisenhower gave this, his military industrial complex warning speech. He warned that government takeover of science was going to allow a scientific, technological elite to seize control of public policy. And Obama was taking him up on that. That's exactly what Obama did. He created this fake scientific technological lead, which basically meant Michael Mann, to seize control of public policy. It wasn't science, it was just a psychological trick. You're not allowed to have an opinion. You can't debate this. If you question what we're saying, you're a climate denier, you're an evil person. It was like the same thing with COVID, right? If you don't wear a mask, you're killing grandma. If you don't get vaccinated, you're killing grandma. If you leave your house, you're killing grandma. If you shop at your neighborhood store, you're killing grandma. You have to shop at Walmart or Tesco or wherever, right? You're only allowed to shop at stores owned by billionaires, by globalist billionaires. And if you don't,
Yes.
you're killing grandma.
It is astonishing, and at the time, I was in the middle of it, and it was fascinating to watch. And it was hard for me to believe until I interviewed Professor Matthias Desmet on the psychology of totalitarianism. One of the most common thing people wrote to me, and they were despairing at their friends and relations couldn't see what obvious nonsense it was. I mean, very sad for aged infirm who were affected by this, probably gain of function, but who knows, laboratory thing. But they just could not come to terms with it, and that's why when I interviewed Professor Desmet, I called it the most important interview I've ever done. Now, it wasn't like all the stuff where I went through mortality and seasonality and virology and all the data. The reason it was so important is because it explained how everyone could be so stupid, because people get into a mass formation of you trust the experts. The education system has indoctrinated them to not critically think, but to trust the experts for decades. And here we are. They are literally hypnotized. And like Orwell, the evidence of their own eyes and ears doesn't work, which is the thing that people can't believe. Look out your window and you knew there was no catastrophe with the COVID flu. But anyway, I go on. We better be mindful of your time. We'll have a quick look at the list again, and I'm just using this as a guide. But I also think it's good because it's what we came up with as a group, and it's just what happened to come up. So the other one was, oh yeah, the IPCC themselves, and some of the people brought this up about increasing weather events. But as you eloquently pointed out, and I link it, that beautiful 12 minutes on how they cheat, the events were much higher in terms of USA with the high temperatures of the 30s, the brush fires. And I think Coonan or someone else has pointed out that overall events, weather or climate events, are down around 90% in general. The fires, the hurricanes, on average, everything is way lower than it was. Is that true?
I don't know if you can make a case that it's way lower. Certainly, deaths from climate and weather are down like 90 to 95%.
That was
Um,
it.
lot of during the terrible heat waves of the 1930s in the United States, like particularly in the summer of 1936, thousands and thousands of people died. And I think on July 14th, 1936, someone was dying from the heat in Detroit every 10 minutes, something like that. It was just incredible. And there's two reasons why that doesn't occur anymore. One is that heat waves have gotten much less severe in the United States since then. They've sort of dropped towards record lows. Hot afternoons in the United States are close to record lows right now. The other thing is we have air conditioning, right? Is that
Yeah.
we do have extremely hot weather. People can go in air conditioning. And what are these globalists are attacking? They're blaming global warming on air conditioning. Say, we have to get rid of air conditioning in order to save people from global warming. Well, air conditioning is exactly what saves people from high temperatures. So it's pretty obvious that their agenda is to kill people. It's not, the air conditioning doesn't cause global warming, but it protects people on hot days. So why are they going after air conditioning? And it's the same thing with the food supply, right? They blame global warming on farmers, right? And they use it as a way to seize control of not only the energy supply, but the food supply too. It's obvious that there's another agenda here. farmers don't have anything to do with global warming. You know, cattle burping doesn't cause global warming. If you go back to like the 16th century during the coldest time, the 16th century was possibly the coldest century of the last 1,000 years, or perhaps the last 8,000 years. There were 50 million bison roaming the Great Plains of the United States. There were huge herds of bovines in Africa and the steppes of Asia too. Well, why didn't those 50 million burping buffalo make it hot? It was very cold back then. The whole there's no science behind what these people are saying. It's just this huge fraud which they've been perpetrating on the public, which can't be backed by evidence, is not backed by evidence, and but it's kept alive by the press maintaining the lie, them censoring everybody, and not allowing anyone to question, and not allowing any other points of view to be heard. They call it misinformation. They ban it as lies, as misinformation, and they're jailing people in the UK and in Germany and places like that for spreading for saying things which the government doesn't want people to hear. And
It,
it's terrible.
yeah, we are going through a kind of a book burning era in a sense from these terrible, terrible globalists. They really are. Pal of mine, George Gammon, says they are anti-human Malthusians. That's essentially what they are. They believe in bringing down the population. They are anti-human, anti-birth, anti-flourishing of humanity, and they want to run an ant farm. At its simplest, they want to run an ant farm, 15-minute cities, and all the rest. Pretty shocking stuff. The evidence against them, we just threw some of these in, but the models we covered, right, widely differ. Predictive power is junk. And I interviewed Brett Weinstein in Hartford at the Brownstone Institute conference. Delighted, had great conversations there, and I interviewed him in person. And one thing he said, because it was a topic about science, and I kind of knew this already, but I loved the way he emphasized it. He said science is really, one of its kernels is predictive power. That's the center of science, that if your science is good, you can predict things very well in the future. And if that's not there, the science is essentially junk. It doesn't matter about all the other things you say and do. So the shocking thing is there's a list, and I think you've shared it, many people have, and the AIERS organization shared 50 climate predictions that were wrong. Like they're literally batting 0 out of 50 over the last several decades. They couldn't be worse scientifically on that prime definition of what science is. So that one carries the whole thing, to be honest. The game is up with that alone. But this one, historical record shows wildly different CO2 levels, of course, and temperatures in the Earth. Correlations are broad, but not always there. And when it correlates, the CO2 goes up around 600 or 800 years, I can't recall, after the temperature has first moved. Isn't that broadly true, that the CO2 is downstream of temperature change, even over Earth's history?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look over the last ice core records from the last 600,000 years, um, you see this correlation between um, the temperature of the ice and the amount of carbon dioxide in it. And that was the basis of Gore's 2006 movie, An Inconvenient Truth. Right? He had that
Yeah.
huge graph he was standing out there next to, showing that there was this correlation. And his interpretation was that carbon dioxide was driving the change in temperature. He didn't have any explanation for what was causing the change in the amount of carbon dioxide, but he just said that, and I don't think people were burning fossil fuels 300,000 years ago, for example. But he didn't have any explanation for that. And it was really funny because I got my bachelor's degree in geology 50 almost 50 years ago. And one of the first things they teach you as a geology student at the university is the relationship between oceanic temperature and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what happens is warm water can't hold as much carbon dioxide. And everyone who's ever opened up a warm beer, knows this. You open up a warm beer bottle, it spews, foam all over the place. Whereas a cold beer bottle won't do that. Um, and that's just, it's because the solubility of carbon dioxide in warm water is lower than it is for cold water. So that's exactly what was going on in these ice core records, is that as the oceans warm, they release more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And it, and so you see there's warming of the oceans, you get more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then when the oceans start cooling, the amount of carbon dioxide in the ocean start absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so it goes down. So, like I said, the relationship is exactly Al Gore had this idea of a relationship. He was putting the cart before the horse. He was saying, it's like saying, wet streets cause rain because whatever the street's wet, it's raining. So therefore, obviously, the wet streets are causing the rain. It's that level of infantile logic, which he was using. And what's really funny about it is that if you look at the carbon dioxide and temperature records from Antarctic ice cores, you can see that ice ages begin right when carbon dioxide is at its peak and ice ages end when it's at its minimum, which is the exact opposite behavior of what would occur if it was carbon dioxide controlling the temperature. But Al Gore was just obsessed with this idea. And one time he said it was scientific malfeasance for anyone to dispute, his idiotic beliefs. He said that any scientist who dispute his beliefs, I think he said they should be prosecuted. Um,
Look, we won't get into motives and all, but we did touch on it. But the thing is, Al Gore is indeed an idiot. I mean, that's clear, I would say. But I would guess he knows he's lying. I would guess he knows he's lying. I can't see that he actually believed his own shtick. That's too much of a stress or a stretch for me. And we're illustrating it here today. You couldn't possibly believe this nonsense if you were engaged in it in a real way. It's impossible. I had here as well, or someone brought up in the critical thinking workshop, myriad sources show near irrelevant temperature increase when UHI or urban heat island effect is not present. And there's just loads of stuff about this that if you take out all the urban temperature measurement stations that have been surrounded by concrete and asphalt, and we know cities get a lot warmer, when you take out all that data, you then see far less warming. And even more so, it's obviously just a natural slow progression. But urban heat island's a big deal, but I think the IPCC, under severe pressure, had to come out and make a statement that, yeah, we don't think it's such a big factor, and they refused to actually investigate it properly. They just said, don't worry about it. That's my understanding.
Yeah, I've shown I've done a few videos showing how essentially all of the warming shown in Central Africa and around and in most of South America is due to urban heat island effects at two stations in Africa. It's at Kinshasa. That's probably the only place where they have any decent long-term data. It's one of the largest cities in the world. They have 16 or 18 million people living in that urban area. It's the same thing in South America. If you, there's very little long-term temperature data in South America except for around Buenos Aires and Uruguay. And if you look at the rural stations in Argentina and in Uruguay, they don't show any warming over the last century. A lot of them show cooling. But Buenos Aires, which is one of the biggest urban heat islands in the world, shows a lot of warming. So what they do is they've created this whole warming trend by just what they call homogenization, where they average out all of the data in the region. And so what they do is they contaminate all of the rural stations in Uruguay and Argentina with this obviously bad data from Buenos Aires. And the Buenos Aires thermometer is located at the Buenos Aires Observatory, which is right in the middle of one of the most densely populated parts of the city. So the whole warming trend, which they show for Africa and South America and for most of South America, is just due to two urban heat islands, and which data which can't be used. It's not legitimate data.
Mm.
Um, and it's terrible what these people are doing. It's not science. No legitimate scientist or engineer would do the horrible things which these people are doing with the thermometer data.
Yeah, I mean they're total. It's total fraud. I'm using the F word quite a bit here, but the point is the state of fraud. There's no question. I'm not going to put too fine a point on it. We mentioned already the 50 predictions. That's a huge one, obviously, and the funny thing is, I explained to the critical thinking workshop. It was a couple hours long, but I went through Popper and scientific proof, and the asymmetry of proof. And you only need a couple, technically only one good piece of contrary evidence to destroy the whole hypothesis. And you can have 1,000 pieces of positive evidence, and it doesn't prove it. So the asymmetry. And here you could fill column after column of evidence against. I mean, it's like, shooting rats in a barrel. But on the politics, so I worked quite a bit with Dr. Jakob Nordengård in Sweden, and he did a PhD on the Rockefeller family, Rockefeller controlling the game. And he was a ponytailed, kind of left of center associate professor in Swedish university, and they're very climatey, a lot of climate professors there. And he did papers on energy politics in Europe, and he was very honestly worried about global warming and worried about the end of oil. And he was so concerned about it. He's the perfect guy because he truly was concerned about this stuff. He went to the professors in the university because he had access, and he wanted to understand more the genesis and the history of these whole hypotheses and where it came from. But not as a cynic and not as a kind of a questioner. He wanted to understand. So long story short anyway, each of them in turn said, oh, well, it really started in 91 or in 89 with the IPCC. And he, of course, asked the obvious emperor's clothes question. Oh, yeah, but before that, the IPCC didn't just spring out of the loins of whoever. And he realized they actually didn't know. So professors in climate didn't even know where their own whole field came from. So he went and looked, and he said a week or two later of research, and it actually went straight back to the Rockefeller Brothers Fund in the 1950s. That's where it came from. The oil man. Oh. But the thing about the politics was, he also explained to me that Arrhenius, who was Swedish, who did the CO2 effect, and I think he was thinking it could save us from a bad ice age, a little, maybe the little effect. But Rockefeller started pouring funding into Sweden, and that's why Sweden's a country that is absolutely full of this nonsense, and they have universities, because Arrhenius's student was working in the 50s on this carbon dioxide model of warming, and Rockefeller started pumping money into him for obvious reasons. So just a bit maybe your thoughts, Tony, on the geopolitics of this. That itself is evidence, not so much scientific evidence for or against. It's evidence of the type a detective would use. Because if you find that something is clearly rotten to the core, you have to move on to motive and more means, motive and opportunity evidence as opposed to scientific. And it's equally valid evidence when you go back and look where it came from. That's very meaningful, right?
Yeah, Arrhenius published his stuff in the 1890s. And in 1901, Newt Angstrom, who's, Nobel laureate in physics, did an analysis of Arrhenius' work and did an experiment and showed what Arrhenius was doing wrong. Or Arrhenius didn't recognize water vapor as a greenhouse gas, and Angstrom demonstrated. He did an experiment where he showed that didn't matter. You could change the amount of carbon dioxide in a column of gas equivalent to Earth's atmosphere by you could double it or have it. Didn't have any effect on the radiative on the amount of radiation passing through because it was already saturated. So Newt Angstrom demonstrated that he said the amount of carbon dioxide, changes in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can't materially affect Earth's radiative balance. I think that was his quote. Um, so it was shown as early as 1901 that Arrhenius had made some critical errors in his calculation. And in 1971, Stephen Schneider and Rasool at NASA did a similar study. They showed that even at, like, I think he said, a 10x increase in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere wouldn't have a huge impact on Earth's climate. But that was 1971. But by the late 1970s, Schneider was saying the exact opposite. And I think it was because he realized that that's where the money was. He became aware that the money for global cooling had disappeared, and now the money was for global warming. So he suddenly changed his tune and became a big global warming alarmist, the same guy. So this is politics. It's not science. It's been known for 125 years almost that Arrhenius was wrong and that he had made a fundamental error in his calculations. But they've kept the scam going and continues. It just ignored reality, ignored the truth, and there's a huge amount of money involved with
Yeah.
pushing this theory. And so it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. It's just keeping the money coming in. It's fame and fortune for these people.
And Tony, there's an element as well. I'm a World War II buff kind of, but Goebbels and the big lie, if you make the lie big enough and it's absurd enough, generally psychologically, people, especially with censorship and propaganda, they won't be able to believe that it's a lie. It's just too big. It's just too big. And I see that with a lot of engineers when I explain to them some basic facts, and they know and they would respect me because I was the top of the heap in technical engineering in my corporate. That was not questioned. But when I said this, you could just see the brain couldn't face up to the conversation because it's just too big to question that. And also they've been indoctrinated that that's climate change denial, and you can't do that or you are crazy. So that's in their little peanut skulls as well. It's a tough one. But we're doing well on this sheet, and I think it's worked reasonably well to give a kind of a framework. But what else? No weather events change based on, oh yeah, a point made by, I think it was John Christie, or it might have been Coonan or Judith. There's a lot of great guys out there, in fairness, they can't say what they really feel, I'd say, but they're trying to do their best to walk the line. But there's around, say, a half degree from Christie in the last half century. Let's say it could be smaller urban heat island, but say a half degree. And someone else made the point, say a degree or 1 point odds in the last century. And during that time, per capita income has gone up 7x. Deaths from hot weather stuff have gone down, like you said, 90%. And on every metric of human flourishing, everything has got vastly better while it went up 1.2. And yet there's a suggestion if it goes up another 1 or 1.5, even if it did, how could you possibly postulate that that will cause a catastrophe? So it's just inherently absurd. I mean, it really is astonishing, even as I repeat it.
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't see any evidence that it's actually warmer now than it was in around 1940. I don't accept that belief, and I think it's just people, even people, climate realists have accepted that just based on hearing the same propaganda over and over again. Um, but so I don't accept that. It certainly has warmed since the satellite record began in 1979, which, as we already discussed, was the coldest year on record in Iceland, and the end of the three coldest winters on record in the United States. So, yeah, it was very cold back then. There's lots of evidence that it was very warm around 1940, 1930s, and 1940s. So yeah, and that was a period when 1940s, people were doing very well. I mean, we had war going on, but civilization had advanced quite a bit, as Earth became warmer during that time. And then people struggled in the 1970s. There were terrible famines going on. And Noah, in the 1974, November 1974 issue of Noah magazine, they attributed these famines to global cooling. And they explained how colder periods tend to cause droughts in places like India. And they showed how during warmer periods in India, the monsoons were more predictable. They came further north, and people there were a lot less people dying during warmer periods in India, and colder periods are what caused people trouble. And that's was so in the 1970s, I think 1976 or 1974, the CIA gave a report warning of this horrible chaos that was going to occur on Earth due to famine caused by global cooling. So yeah, so cold humans have difficulty in colder periods, and they do well during warmer periods. We've seen that over and over again around the time that the Egyptians built the pyramids. It was a very warm period and civilization thrived. Stonehenge was built at a time during a very warm period. But during cold periods like the Little Ice Age, Europeans were dying in mass numbers from disease, right? So cold periods are hard on people. Warm periods, humans do well. Humans still like to vacation in warm places because humans like warm weather. They do well in warm weather. No, a lot of people vacate, a lot of people in Canada vacation in Mexico. You don't see very many people from the Yucatan vacationing in Winnipeg during the winter. And there's good reason for that. Humans are not made for cold weather. Humans are designed for warm weather. So the whole idea that warming is bad, warm weather is bad, is just utterly absurd. So what they do instead, they try to create these fake stories about warm weather means more heat waves. Um, Even though it's very clear that heat waves are way down in the United States. They talk about melting Arctic ice and cities are going to drown. They've been making these ridiculous claims forever. That's not happening. The cities aren't drowning. Um, so it's sort of traditional, right? People have been raised to believe that humans' sins cause bad weather, right? This first things you're taught is that Noah's flood was caused by people's sins. So it's very easy for them to push this idea that our carbon sins are going to cause us to drown in the great flood, or they're going to cause us to burn up in fire, like Sodom and Gomorrah. So this is imagery which people have had drilled into them since they were children, that your sins, your carbon sins, are going to cause you to burn up and drown. So they're just latching on to traditional ideas, that people have always believed. It's not happening. None of these things that are saying that are actually occurring. Deaths from weather events are down 90 to 95% over the past century. But you've got a public who's addicted to fear porn, right? So they just the mainstream media keeps throwing this fear porn at them. Miami's going to drown. Like, I believe the Washington Post has been pushing all this propaganda about rising sea levels in Florida drowning. Meanwhile, Jeff Bezos has been buying up hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property at Miami Beach. Obama pushed all this sea level rise, fear poured while he was president. And as soon as he got out of office, he bought $30 million worth of mansions on the beach in Massachusetts and Hawaii. They obviously don't believe any of this nuts.
Hey, I was going to say Beelzebub Billy, of course, Mr. Gates, who's in every evil enterprise that we've seen over the past decade or two. I mean, clearly as well, they know obviously that this is nonsense because they're pretty cute hooers or smart guys to have gotten up to where they are. And there's no way they believe it. And like the masks as well and all the COVID flu. I mean, we have all the clips now of the top people like Ardern in New Zealand, Prince Charles with Biden. The clips go on and on where they look around, the cameras go off, and they take off their masks and often even joke about it. This is the reality. So anyone who's listening who still clings to this absurdity, just remember, not only is it nonsense, which it certainly is, but the people pushing it are actually laughing at you. And I often remind people of that. They're laughing at you.
Yeah, one of my favorite videos, I think it was from 60 Minutes. It was Richard Branson and Al Gore, and they asked the interviewer asked Branson, "Is Al Gore a climate prophet?" And Branson just broke out laughing, and he said, "Well, I guess it depends on how you spell prophet."
In a nutshell, yeah. And I don't recall if Branson, he would get his arm twisted to play along with the nonsense like any big guy, but I don't recall him coming up much in the whole climate nonsense that I can think of. So that's funny. He told the truth on camera. I love it. Well, you know what, Tony? When you make the interviews too long, of course, I'm not Joe Rogan, sadly, and people don't tend to watch. So we'll probably try and keep it around the hour. But any last thoughts to wrap it up, maybe?
Yeah, I just say, just do your own research. Um, if you look at the historical records, if you look at the actual data, you can see that all these claims about things getting worse, extreme weather, increased flooding, increased fires, increased heat waves simply aren't true. The reality is, like you mentioned, the human condition has gotten much better. People live much longer, more comfortable lives than they ever have at any time in history. And this is largely due to fossil fuels. Before fossil fuels, people lived short, dark, cold lives. Now people can keep their sick children warm. They fossil fuels bring the food to the store so they're not starving anymore. In the 1970s, there's all these warnings from the experts that we're all going to starve to death, right? Instead, we have obesity, terrible obesity problems. And these experts don't know what they're talking about. Or perhaps they do. What they're talking about is just bringing in money and fame and fortune for themselves. But it's not about science. That you're being scammed by these academics and the press who are pushing agendas that have nothing to do with what they're saying. It's the big lie.
Yeah, in a nutshell, that is it. And, you've done fantastic work, Tony. You're one of the biggest guys out there to point to the obvious scam that this is. And lots of other people making an effort too. But I was delighted when I looked into it. I found some of your material and other people I mentioned, like Christie, etc. And I was delighted how quickly it was obviously nonsense, because that gave me some hope for the future that eventually it will collapse under the weight of its own absurdity. So here's to that, eh?
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully, Trump and Musk will cut off the root of this, which is funding. If they can shut down the funding, then these academics will have to go and try to find some other way to make money other than just lying about climate. And that
Yeah.
would be a very
Or
good thing.
or heaven forbid they'll have to get a real job, eh? Oh, tough times.
I would assume that they had some skills which made them employable. And I don't see much indication that these climate academics have any actual marketable skills. So I can understand why they're clinging to this so hard.
Well, they couldn't get involved in various, I don't know, shell tricks and con artist enterprises, so there's always something that might suit them.
Well, they're obviously experts at that. That's what they've been doing all these years.
Yeah. Hey, thanks so much, Tony. And we might check in a few months and kind of see, are things moving in a more logical or rational or sane direction with the new guys in the US. So we might check in on that. Thank you.
Great. Sounds good.
Well, that'll do it, folks. As I mentioned there, ivorcumminsworkshops.com is my latest project. And if you'll see on the homepage there, I've just put a selection of the testimonials from people who have already attended. We're developing these workshops around 2.5 hours generally each. working with the attendees and improving them as we go. But already I think we're getting to a very good level, so very happy with that. So if you want to get involved, join up, help support this new system. I'm going to be adding more and more topics as we go forward. But for the moment, I think the mental strength and resilience and cognitive behavioral psychology, I go through all the jewels. The critical thinking, I go through the core tools of critical thinking and problem solving with worked examples. And of course, weight loss is a thing that many people struggle with, having a proper summary of the best possible practices under 4 headings of nutrition, planning, practices, and of course psychology of weight loss, which is probably one of the most important things. In any case, ivorcumminsworkshops.com. Be superb if you help support us and come along, and that'll do us. Thank you.